afternoon, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural program being organized by the American Foreign and Military Policy Research Cluster here at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University. Today, we are going to be parsing What's in a Name, the dispute over renaming US Army bases. My name is Jennifer Siegel, and I am a professor of European diplomatic and military history in the Department of History here at OSU. And I'm also a senior faculty fellow at the Mershon Center. Our goal here this afternoon is to add historical context and understanding to one of the hot and contentious topics of these past few months, the debate over the renaming of a number of military bases and installations in this country that were named in honor of certain officers of the Confederate Army, which lost the American Civil War. As everyone, I'm sure, knows, in July, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, told the House Armed Services Committee, quote, "The Confederacy, the American Civil War, was fought and it was an act of rebellion. It was an act of treason against the Union, against the Stars and Stripes, against the US Constitution. Those officers turned their back on their oath." As General Milley sees it, quote, "Those generals fought for the institution of slavery. We have to take a hard look at the symbology." Now, Milley's assessment was also echoed by the Defense Appropriations Bill that the Republican-controlled Senate overwhelmingly passed, which calls for the renaming of the US military bases and installations named for the Confederate officers. Of course, not everyone is in agreement with this call for change, and the president quickly tweeted that his administration would never rename the bases in question. Now, all this current and heightened back and forth has, of course, been inspired by the nationwide Black Lives Matter protests sparked by the police killing of George Floyd. But the push for these base name changes is nothing new. In fact, the process has already been in motion. In February of this year, the Marine Corps Commandant ordered the removal of Confederacy paraphernalia from bases worldwide. A number of Navy vessels had been named for Confederate officers or battles, but most of them have been retired, with the exception of the USS Chancellorsville. Now, my colleagues, those of whom you have really come to hear today, my colleagues are far better positioned to explain the foundations of this debate and its current state. So let me move us all closer to hearing what they have to say by introducing our three panelists for this afternoon. In the order in which we will be hearing from them, they are Professors Mark Grimsley, Hassan Kwame Jeffries, and Peter Mansour, all professors in the Department of History here at The Ohio State University. Professor Grimsley is a specialist in 19th century American military history. He is, among other things, the author of The Hard Hand of War, Union Military Policy Towards Southern Civilians, 1861 to 1865, and Keep Moving On, the Virginia Campaign, May to June, 1864. Mark currently is writing a book on the connections between the 1864 military and political campaigns, which will be published by Oxford University Press. Professor Jeffries is a specialist in African American history and is the author of Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt. His current book project, entitled Stealing Home, Ebbets Field and Black Working Class Life in Post-Civil Rights New York, explores the struggle of working class African Americans to secure and enjoy their freedom rights by examining the experiences of the residents of the affordable housing complex built in 1962 on the former site of Ebbets Field, home of Brooklyn Dodgers before they betrayed New York and moved west. Professor Mansour is the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at The Ohio State University, a senior faculty fellow at the Mershon Center, and along with myself and Rick Herman, a co-director of the American Foreign and Military Policy Research Cluster. Pete came to us at Ohio State after a 26-year career in the US Army that included 2 combat tours in Iraq. He's the author of The GI Offensive in Europe, The Triumph of American Infantry Divisions, 1941 to 1945, Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq, and Surge, My Journey with General David Petraeus and the Remaking of the Iraq War. Pete is currently working on a campaign history of the liberation of the Philippines during World War II. Now, before I hand things over to Mark, I would like to just highlight what you all read in the slide earlier, that you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll be reading questions out when we reach the question and answer portion of our session this afternoon. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Professor Grimsley.
Thanks, Jenny, and welcome to our, everybody that is out there. My job today is to talk to you about the actual generals for whom these various bases are named, and in terms of military talent, it's a pretty mixed bag that we're looking at. It's really, yeah. When you've got Braxton Bragg, for example, in charge of a military installation, Braxton Bragg, in the minds of some, was a general whose combat performance was so uneven that he may be said to have done his share of assuring Union victory. There are a number of other people who surprised me by being on the list. For instance, Fort Rucker down in Alabama is named not for a Confederate general, but for a Confederate colonel. Rucker was supposed to have received a commission as general, but it never came through. He fought with General Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry during the war, but doesn't seem to have had a particularly distinguished career. Had a pretty distinguished post-war career, however. He made a lot of money in Alabama, and you kind of notice that the military post, Fort Rucker, is located in Alabama. And the decisions about who was actually going to have who would actually be naming these installations, as we're going to see, these were made locally. And so it may very well be that it was Rucker's business acumen that led to him being given the privilege or whatever you might want to call it of having a military installation named after him. Fort Belvoir, up close to Washington, D.C., actually is not named for a Confederate general at all. It's named for Belvoir Plantation, which was on the site of what had previously been Camp Andrew A. Humphreys. Now, Camp Andrew A. Humphreys was not a Confederate at all. Captain Andrew A. Humphreys was a division commander in the Union Army, had a pretty good career. He wound up being chief of staff to George Gordon Meade, who actually commanded the Army of the Potomac in 1864, 1865, Meade commanding what frequently was referred to as Grant's army, since it was engaged with Lee, and Grant accompanied that particular army. But Humphreys was the Union general who was in charge of it. So that surprised me that here you have a military installation that had actually been named for a Union general, renamed for no general at all. Since it was a Virginia congressman that made the request, however, I suppose there's an outside chance he just wanted to get rid of a military installation that was named for a Confederate general. But there are still some other ones in Virginia that are named for federal generals. Excuse me. So we go down the list in order, according to a good slide that Professor Mansour supplied everyone. We have Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia. And like all of these installations, Fort A.P. Hill happened to be founded in the early part of the Second World War. The rest of them were founded in the First World War. And what you're dealing with are in military installations that were created and continued because of the massive expansion of manpower and the massive need for additional training space and so on as a result of the war, World War I and World War II. A.P. Hill was the Third Corps commander in the Army of Northern Virginia. He had an interesting but uneven career. There were days in which he performed wonderfully. As a division commander in 1862, he conducted a forced march of 17 miles to reach the battlefield at Antietam, arrived at a crucial moment, and became known as the Blucher of Sharpsburg by staving off the federal attack at the very last moment. But in other battles of the Civil War, A.P. Hill is curiously missing. We just can't find him. We don't know what's going on with him. At Gettysburg, he's on the field of Gettysburg somewhere. We hardly know where. And because he had these maladies that plagued him from time to time. One of them just eluded us for a long time until a biographer, James I. Robertson Jr., known to his friends as Bud, ran the whole matter to ground. And what he concluded, with the help of a physician, was Hill had chronic prostatitis brought on by acquiring gonorrhea as a cadet at the U.S. Military Academy back in the day. So definitely sow what you reap, or reap what you sow there. Fort Belvoir, as I say, is named for a plantation, named for a bunch of trees. Fort Lee, we all know who Fort Lee is named for. That's Robert E. Lee. And it would have been a no-brainer for anybody who had the privilege of naming these installations to name one for Robert E. Lee. But Robert E. Lee by this time was a national hero. Robert E. Lee by this time had his face on a U.S. stamp, U.S. postage stamp. So he was considered at the time something of a national hero, not just a Southern hero, but a national one. It's an interesting, it is an interesting historical place that Lee occupied. Fort Pickett. This is just who you think it would be. This is Fort George. This is General George E. Pickett of Pickett's Charge fame, and that was sort of Pickett's most the name for which, or the battle for which he is the most famous, but it was far from the only one. And perhaps some people who decided to name it Fort Pickett were unaware that Robert E. Lee, in the closing days of the Civil War, about a week before Appomattox, Pickett was in charge of the Confederate defense at Five Forks in April 1st, 1865. He botched the job, and Lee relieved him of duty. Saw Pickett subsequently and said icily, "What is that man doing here?" So he's again an interesting choice. He's most famous for a disastrous charge, and he gets relieved from duty by Robert E. Lee, for whom an installation is named, just a week before the end of the war. Fort Bragg, I mentioned earlier, is a high-ranking Confederate general, one of just a few full generals, Robert E. Lee being another. Bragg had a controversial career, I was being a little facetious by saying that he contributed to Union victory. But he, in certain of his military victories, it was felt that he did not capitalize upon them enough. He was unpopular with the senior leadership, some of his corps and division commanders who actively undermined him at times. He was such an unpleasant person that the professor, this is a few years ago, a few decades ago, the professor who was writing a 2-volume biography of Bragg just got sick of Bragg after volume 1 and turned responsible for volume 2 over to a graduate student. I kid you not, that's how things went down. Fort Rucker, I've told you about. Fort Polk is named for Leonidas Polk. And Polk is an interesting fellow. He was he was a bishop before the war. Yes, the religious bishop, an Episcopalian bishop. He had gone to West Point, had graduated from West Point, and then decided that there was a higher calling that he had to obey. And he remained a prominent Episcopalian bishop until the war broke out. Then he went back into military service. His military career, in terms of how he handled things, tactically and whatnot, was a pretty mixed bag. A point in his favor is that he got General John Bell Hood. We'll get to him in a moment. He's the one for whom Fort Hood, Texas. He got a Confederate General John Bell Hood to be baptized, and he did it himself. Polk did in the early hours of an evening in May 1864. Polk had an interesting demise a couple of months later during the Atlanta campaign. He and a few officers were at the summit of a mountain, and a federal artillerist, guy's last name was Dilger, who was known as a particularly brilliant artillerist, spied this group of Confederate generals who were just lounging around on this particular hilltop, fired around with the cannon, and the cannon shot not only hit near the Confederate generals, it hit Polk directly, and Bishop Polk got to meet the Lord that day. So taken on the whole, it wasn't an entire loss for Polk. Next, Camp Beauregard, PGT Beauregard. That's in Louisiana. Beauregard was in charge of the attack on Fort Sumter. The bombardment begins on April 12th, 1861. And Beauregard briefly was sort of a darling of everyone in the Confederate South because of his role in the victory at Fort Sumter. Incidentally, it could hardly have been otherwise. The fort was nearly out of food. It had a garrison of exactly 65 men. Beauregard had enough artillery that ringed the harbor around Charleston Harbor. It was just going to be a rollover. Beauregard, a few months later, was in charge at the Battle of First Manassas, also called First Bull Run, and he had a problematic day because the Federals who attacked him on the day of July 21st, 1861, actually managed a near breakthrough until additional Confederate troops under Joseph Johnston. It's interesting that Joe Johnston is not on this thing. Joe Johnston was not well liked by Jefferson Davis at all, and had maybe that post-war that ire against Johnston survived into the post-war era. But in any event, Beauregard was saved at First Manassas by Johnston. Beauregard went out west. He served, among other places, at the Battle of Shiloh, second in command under Albert Sidney Johnston, who was the commander at Shiloh, but bled to death from a leg wound, in the leg. He bled out with a wound that any Boy Scout could have taken care of with a tourniquet. That turned command over to Beauregard, who did absolutely nothing to help gain victory at Shiloh. And the next day, the tables are turned as Ulysses S. Grant launches a successful counterattack. A few weeks later, Beauregard, who's in charge of the Confederate Army around Corinth, Mississippi, which is about 20 miles south of Shiloh, retreats in the face of a large advancing Federal Army, and then kind of sort of goes on vacation, which President Jefferson Davis did not appreciate, and led to his replacement by Braxton Bragg, whom I mentioned earlier. Finally, we get to Fort Hood, Texas, which is named for General John B. Hood. That's the fellow who was baptized by Polk that I mentioned earlier. But that's kind of a piece of trivia. The key thing about Hood is that he became not just a full Confederate general, which was rare, but also the commander of the Army of Tennessee, not to be confused with the Army of the Tennessee, which was a Union Army, but the Army of Tennessee. And he was placed in command in mid-July 1864 by Jefferson Davis, with orders to be aggressive in trying to turn back the army of Major General William T. Sherman, which was advancing toward Atlanta. And boy, did Hood ever give it the good old college try. With inferior forces, he sallied forth against Sherman's army on a number of occasions. And there are some who said that Hood did a good job of it, but that's a kind of a revisionist view. The sort of traditional view is that Hood did a good job of beating up on his own army with a series of ill-advised attacks. However, I think that the reason that Hood is probably became the recipient, or whatever, his memory became the recipient of a federal military installation being named for him. It's Texas, after all. And Hood first came to fame as the commander of the Texas Brigade. That's how he made his reputation early on. His name was associated with the Texas Brigade throughout the conflict, even though he went on to other kinds of assignments. And I bet real money that the people who named Fort Hood for him were thinking of his service in charge of the Texas Brigade, and not his service in charge of the Army of Tennessee. So with that, I have had my say concerning the people for whom these installations are named, and I think our next speaker is Hassan Jeffries. Is it Hassan? Are you coming on after me?
I am here, but Dr. Mansour, is it you or me?
You're next.
All right, I'm up.
Okay.
I was in the batter's deck. Thank you very much. It is, let me see, share my video. Thank you very much. It is good to be with you, and it's good to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts and ideas on this important subject, a relevant subject, and a subject that has real contemporary importance for us. What I want to do is just offer a little bit of context for the moment in which we began to see these various installations and forts and the like being renamed. In other words, what was going on at this particular moment that led for the naming of these bases and the desire to name these bases after various supporters of the Confederacy. The first thing to point out is that, this is World War I. So that means, of course, we're talking about the second decade of the earliest 20th century. That means as well that this is 50 years after the Civil War, 50 years after the Confederacy engaged in, or these various officers engaged in rebellion, traitorous actions against the United States, 50 years after they lost this war, and so, or this rebellious action. And so the question then becomes not only why name it after these folk who were traitors, but then why do it then? What was going on in this particular moment in the second decade of the 20th century that leads to this renaming? Well, during that particular moment, especially in the South, and particularly in the South, but especially in the South, but there's also a national connection here. We were literally in this moment of a resurgence of white supremacy. Coming on the heels of the Civil War, there's a period of Reconstruction in which the federal government, under the control of the Republican Party, the inheritors of the Union victory, in partnership and collaboration with African Americans in the South, have a measure of political authority and are working towards creating a South that looked different than the South that existed while slavery existed. But that moment of Reconstruction, that moment of reimagining what the South would look like, that moment of extending basic civil rights and human rights to African Americans did not last very long. In fact, many places in many states by the early 1870s, and definitely by the late 1870s at the state level, essentially what we call redemption had already occurred. Former Confederates, Democrats, now still back within the Union fold, but as Democrats had regained control of state legislatures. Over the next decade, by early 1890, they would work to consolidate their political power and political authority, starting at the state level and then trickling down to the county level. There's a stretch of counties throughout the South known as the Black Belt that are majority African American, overwhelmingly African American. In many of these counties, the percentage of African Americans then and still to this day reached as high as 80%. And so it wasn't simply a matter of we can just outvote these folk to gain control of county courthouses and county government and regional authority. They literally had to steal these ballots, steal the votes, steal the elections through fraud, intimidation, outright violence, and theft. By 1890 or so, this consolidation of political power, which many call the triumph of white supremacy, the reassertion of Southern white authority and power, the reassertion of white control or attempting to control over Black labor was pretty solid. This begins starting in 1890 with Mississippi. We see a series of state constitutions. Every state and the former Confederacy will rewrite its state constitution between 1890 and 1910, and for the sole purpose of disenfranchising African Americans. So when the political, and they succeed. So we have a massive effort that is successful of wiping clear African Americans from the ballot rolls and knocking them out of the public square when it comes to thinking about political participation and having the ballot. And so by the time we get to World War I, what we have seen over the last 50 years building up to it, and certainly over the last 35 to 40 years, is a concerted and successful effort to make sure that white supremacy was not only the dominant ideology that was governing, the Southland, but that it was deeply entrenched, that it informed all things political, that it informed all things economic, and that it informed all things social. This is the era of Jim Crow, of separate but not equal, of segregation. And so we see, like, during this moment, this is also the same time, right around World War I, you've consolidated political power, you've reestablished economic power and authority, and you have the social component of Jim Crow to always reassert and reaffirm white supremacy while also projecting this image of Black inferiority. It is during this moment, this is also the height of lynching, where 2 to 3 African Americans are being publicly murdered somewhere in the United States, most often in the South, every week. And it is during this moment where we begin to see a concerted effort to also spread or take over and occupy public space with the images or the markings of white supremacy. This is during the moment where we begin to see a real groundswell in support for, in the South, monuments and memorials to the Confederate Army. This is when we begin to see all these damn participation trophies to the Confederacy beginning to litter the landscape of the South. And so it is not a surprise at all that as we begin to see this World War I mobilization, that you would have Democratic elected officials, white supremacists in the Democratic Party in the South, who are advancing this cause of putting the stamp of white supremacy in all things public, that are having these unveilings on college campuses, in front of county courthouses and the like, of these monuments to white supremacy, of these Confederate generals and Confederate officers, that they would take advantage of the opportunity on the part of the federal, that the federal government is making available by wanting to and needing to establish military bases for this pre-World War I or World War I mobilization, that they would take advantage of that opportunity to insist upon naming these bases after these Confederate officers, generals, and the like. That was all in an effort to reassert, reestablish, plant roots of white supremacy in the public square as reminders, not only to white folk about what the society ought to look like, but also as reminders to African Americans that this is, as they would have said then, a white man's society. That is the driving, compelling context and motivation for the naming of these various bases and installations after these Confederate officers. See, the Confederacy, and it's not so surprising that it's after 50 years, because the myth making, this is the last point, I'll move on, I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Mansour. You've had 50 years of myth making about what the Confederacy was all about. And so my colleague, Dr. Grimsley has said as well, by that moment, Robert E. Lee is kind of a national hero, a national icon. Well, that's in part because by the time you get to the 1890s, you begin to see Northern intellectuals, Northern academics, sociologists. Sociology is a sort of a new school. Criminology is sort of a new school of academic thought. We see them in the 1890s starting to look back to the antebellum era and saying, you know what? We think they might have been on to something. That, yeah, slavery, that probably wasn't a good idea, but they understood that Black folk couldn't be trusted. They understood that Black folk were prone to criminality. All of these sort of racial stereotypes we see beginning to be articulated and rationalized and justified, to rationalize and justify white supremacy coming from the North, outside of the South. And so while we talk about sort of the Confederacy as this, this effort to preserve and promote slavery, which it was, Alexander Stephens, slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy, and it was. but white supremacy was a national ideology. And so by the time we get to the 1890s, white supremacy is actually serving as a unifying ideology for white Americans, regardless of region. And so we begin to see this notion that, well, it wasn't so much a traitorous action as, you know, we understood that this was an effort about valor. This was an effort about culture. This was an effort about heritage. We see that myth making already. But the reason why, I mean, they could have picked a poet to name these bases after, but they chose these Confederate officers solely because they represented this effort to maintain slavery, to maintain white supremacy, and to keep Black folk bound in chains, both literally and figuratively. And this last point I'll make as well. This wasn't the end of it. The naming of these bases is just a moment that reflects this cultural trend to reassert white supremacy. There will be another moment as well where we begin to see the Confederate iconography entering into the public square again, and that is in the 1950s and 1960s in direct response to the African-American civil rights movement. We see the Confederate battle flag being inserted into state flags in the South, South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi, and the like. We see the naming of schools after Confederate generals. And again, this was about reasserting white supremacy. And so we can't separate out at all the context in which these bases and installations and the like were named. They were done solely for the purpose of marking white supremacy and this nation as a white supremacist, and the South as a white supremacist nation. And so I have no problem whatsoever with those folk who look at that and say, we need to go in a different direction. This isn't, as Dr. Grimsley pointed out, no one's saying they didn't do what they did. They fought, and yes, they lost. So this isn't about rewriting that. This isn't about revising that. It's about being clear that the reason why they were being celebrated should not, certainly in this moment, unfortunately that it did then, should not reflect our core principles and interests as a nation today. So with that, I'll pause and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Mansour.
Thanks, Hassan. I am going to talk about what the alternatives are. If we want to rename these bases, who do we rename them after? What should some of the ground rules be? But I want to start by talking about a base, Fort Benning, Georgia, which is the home to not only the United States Infantry now, but also to the Armor Center. So it's really the combined arms center of the United States Army, the premier training base for combat arms troops in the United States Army. You would think that it would be named after someone fairly significant, perhaps someone who actually served in the United States Army. I've had a lot of discussions with my fellow veterans about base renaming, and there are a few saying, well, some of these officers, you know, they're okay. They, like Lee, you know, he did fight in Mexico honorably. He had a long US Army career. Maybe we should honor him for that. Well, General Henry L. Benning never served in the United States Army. In fact, his only military service came in the Confederate Army. He is best known for drafting Georgia's Ordinance of Secession from the Union as a politician. He did have a military career. He commanded what was known as Benning's Brigade in Longstreet's Corps, was in several major engagements. His view towards slavery was that he would rather be stricken with illness and starvation than see slaves be given equality as citizens. And unlike some Confederate officers, not many, I think James Longstreet might come to mind, he never renounced that view, ever. He went back to Georgia after the war. He practiced law, and he died in the 1870s. So why is Fort Benning named after him? Well, Camp Benning was created, I think, in the World War I, in the World War I timeframe, as one of dozens, if not hundreds, of Army bases that were created to raise the National Army 4 million soldiers, most of them drafted, had to be trained, 2 million of them deployed overseas, 1 million eventually engaged in combat in France and other places in World War I. And when it came time to build the post, the Rotary Club of Columbus, the other Columbus, Georgia, said, well, we'd like to name it after one of our favorite sons, Henry L. Benning, commander of Benning's brigade during the Civil War. And the US Army said, or the War Department actually said, okay. That's pretty much the amount of thought that went into most of these base namings. The War Department simply acceded to the wishes of the local community. I have heard other people say, well, if you rename the bases, it has to be renamed by someone who was from that state. But that's not the case at all. Fort McClellan, Alabama, in the Deep South, is named after one of the Union Army commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. Fort Myer, Virginia, named after the first Union Signal Corps officer. So there are bases already in the South named after Union generals. So that should not be an issue. Now I have some slides that I'm going to share. And someone pipe up if you can't see them. So what should be the principles on renaming US Army bases? And these are just some that I thought up. You might disagree or you might have more. But I think the first one is the person honored should have some loyal and significant service in either the Continental Army in the Revolutionary period or the US Army. In other words, no Confederate officers. The person must be deceased. Too soon for Fort Colin Powell and others. Norman Schwarzkopf is deceased, so I guess he would be in the running. A state tie-in is a plus, but it's not essential. And I mentioned a couple of examples of bases named after officers who were not from that state. I think you'd like to match the base function, what it does today, like Fort Benning Combat Arms, with the expertise of the honoree. So probably not right to name Fort Benning after the head of the Women's Army Corps, although I do have a base named after her, and we'll get to that. Consider race and gender, because they're vastly underrepresented in terms of base namings. And there are people who I think are worthy of being honored in that regard for their Army service, not just for their race or gender. Other considerations, Medal of Honor recipients. There are some people who have gone on public and said, well, we should name all the bases after enlisted soldiers who've won the Medal of Honor. I think that's going too far, but I think it's a consideration. And I have heard the president say, oh, the soldiers who have deployed from these bases will be devastated if they're renamed. I don't think so. I've talked to a number of my fellow veterans. No one was like, let's win one for old Fort Hood. Most of the soldiers who served at these bases have no idea who the bases are named for, or just only a foggy idea that they were, maybe a Confederate general. So really the renaming is not really an issue for the veterans and their legacy. It's a political issue, as we all know. And as Hassan, I think, pointed out very well. So here are the bases, the 11 bases. Fort A.P. Hill is a Joint and Combined Arms Training Center. Fort Belvoir, home to the Blue-Gray Division, the 29th Infantry Division. Also home to 10 major Army commands and 19 different agencies. It's a big base right there near Washington, D.C. It's got a lot of administrative headquarters there, and you'll see that comes into how I would rename it. Fort Lee, Virginia, named after Robert E. Lee, is the U.S. Army Ordnance Center and School. Fort Pickett, named after George Pickett, the Army National Guard Maneuver Training Center. Fort Bragg, you heard Mark talk about his legacy, but it is the premier airborne training center in the United States. The 18th Airborne Corps is there, Army Special Operations, the Green Berets are there. Fort Benning, Georgia, I've talked about. Fort Gordon in Georgia is home to the Signal Corps and now the Cyber Command. Fort Rucker is a U.S. Army Aviation Command. Fort Polk, Louisiana, the Joint Readiness Training Center, one of the two really great national training centers that we have in the United States. Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, is a National Guard training center for the Louisiana National Guard. And Fort Hood, Texas, where I served, is home to some of the premier fighting units in the United States, the 1st Cavalry Division and the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, to be precise. So let's begin, and I'll try to go through these as quickly as I can. I would rename Fort A.P. Hill Fort Kilbourne. Now, who was he? Charles Kilbourne actually was a graduate of VMI. He played a significant role in the fortification of Corregidor Island, which played a huge role in the beginning of World War II. He served in a couple of different combat units in World War I. He was wounded. He was, at the time, the only officer in the United States Army to hold the nation's top 3 awards for valor and service: the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, and the Medal of Honor. You know, and on top of that, he rose to Major General, and when he retired, he became Superintendent of VMI for 9 years. You would think that he would be, you know, that there would be a base in Virginia named after him. He has a pretty significant career and honorable service in the United States Army. Fort Belvoir, the home to all those agencies and commands, I would name after Mary E. Clarke, who was the longest serving WAC in the history of the US Army. In fact, she was the longest serving female officer, woman officer in the history of the US Army until Ann Dunwoody just retired. Ann Dunwoody was the first 4-star woman officer in the United States Army. She's still alive though, so out of the running as far as I'm concerned. Clarke enlisted in the Women's Army Corps just before World War II ended. She served all the way into the late 70s. She was the first woman to command an Army base, Fort McClellan, Alabama. The Army, I think, would get, actually, in my view, Mark might disagree with this, I think it would get bonus points if it renamed Fort McClellan, Alabama after her, since that's where she actually commanded. But I think she deserves a post to be named after her. And so Fort Clarke it is. Fort Lee, I would rename after John Buford, played a significant role in the first day at Gettysburg, chose the ground on which the Union Army would fight. And he died before his time, unfortunately, died of typhoid fever. Otherwise, he would have played, I think, the role that Phil Sheridan played later in the war and after the war. He probably would have risen to become the commander of the Union, of the Federal Army after the war at some point. Buried at West Point next to Alonzo Cushing, who received a Medal of Honor for his role in defending against Pickett's charge. And I think, you know, if you look at what his fellow officers had to say about him, they all highly revered his service as a Union cavalry leader. So just think he deserves a place in the Pantheon. And if not Buford, by the way, I think Fort Chamberlain, named after Joshua Chamberlain, would be a good alternative, who won the Medal of Honor defending Little Round Top. It went on to become a major general, a division commander, famously presented arms to honor the Confederate Army as it was surrendering at Appomattox, in reaching out to fellow combat veterans, albeit on different sides of the fight. This is an interesting one, and I'd really like to get Mark's take maybe in the Q&A session, but I would name Fort Pickett Fort Thomas after George Thomas, one of the few Southern officers who decided that his oath to the Union overrode his loyalty to his home state. He's a Virginian, served in the Mexican Army in Mexico, was instrumental in saving the Army of the Tennessee at the Battle of Chickamauga. It's known as the Rock of Chickamauga as a result of his actions there. His troops made a dramatic breakthrough on Missionary Ridge at the Battle of Chattanooga. And he destroyed John Bell Hood's army at the Battle of Nashville in December 1865. So why doesn't he have a base named after him? Because he served in the Union Army. People of Virginia shunned him after the war. And again, if Mark has anything to add to that in Q&A, I'd like to hear it. But he was a persona non grata in his home state because he served in the Union blue and not the Confederate gray. And I think it shows the hypocrisy of why these bases were named the way they were. So Fort Bragg, the premier airborne center, well, let's name it after the premier airborne officer in the U.S. Army history, and that would be, in my view, Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway. Instrumental role in the Normandy invasion, in the Operation Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge. He took over the 8th Army in Korea when it was on the ropes after the Chinese intervened and turned defeat into victory, literally. And then he took over as the overall commander when Douglas MacArthur was relieved of command, and served in that capacity, served as one of the first few Supreme Allied commanders in Europe. And as Chief of Staff of the US Army, gave instrumental and very important advice to President Dwight Eisenhower to stay out of Vietnam when the French were being defeated at Dien Bien Phu. And it was really a sage piece of advice. So for a variety of reasons, I think he'd be a good pick. Ronald Reagan awarded him a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1986. Fort Benning, I would name it after Sergeant Alvin York, one of the premier sergeants who came out of World War I, earned the Medal of Honor for a patrol that ended up capturing more than 130 prisoners. And then after the war, what did he do? Well, he returned home. He formed a charitable foundation to improve educational opportunities for rural children. He came from a very rural and impoverished background himself. He worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps. You know, he is worthy of being honored with a base name, not just for his service, but for his life after service. Fort Gordon, Colonel Charles Young, Fort Young. Charles Young was one of the first 3 African Americans to graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He's the first one that actually rose to senior rank, full colonel. And he would have been a general except for blatant racism in the Wilson administration. He had done all the things you needed to do to command at higher levels. He was also a military attaché. And when World War I broke out, he wanted to go overseas and command. Well, because of his seniority, he would have had to have been promoted to brigadier general and be given command of a brigade. And that meant he would have had white officers underneath him, and the Wilson administration forcibly retired him. It was an egregious act of racism. By the way, if you haven't been to Wilberforce near Dayton, the Charles Young House is there, and there is a museum. The African American Museum is there as well, and they have a nice exhibit on him. But he's definitely deserving of having a post named after him. The premier aviation base for the United States Army, well, let's name it after one of the premier helicopter pilots in US Army history. Michael Novosel began his career flying B-29s. Actually took a reduction in grade from Lieutenant Colonel to Chief Warrant Officer 4 to be able to re-enter active duty during the Vietnam conflict. By the time he retired, he had more flight hours than any other person in US Army history, 12,400 military flying hours, 2,000 of them in combat. Just an incredible record, and a Medal of Honor for a heroic rescue of 29 South Vietnamese soldiers who were surrounded and under fire near the Cambodian border. The main street of Fort Rucker is already named Novosel Street, so it would be an easy promotion to just name the rest of the base after him as well. Fort Polk. Well, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, he's actually from Texas, but only 6 hours away from Fort Polk. Son of a Mexican farmer and an Indian mother, dropped out of school, kind of like Alvin York, to work to support his family. He was horribly wounded in his first tour in Vietnam, told he would never walk again, and just willed himself to recover and did. Went back, volunteered to go back, and earned the Medal of Honor for actions in 1968 when a Special Forces patrol was pinned down and he voluntarily flew in. He was a medic to help them, and saved a number of soldiers' lives. Everyone thought he was dead. He had 37 different wounds. He was actually in a body bag being zipped up when he spit in the face of the doctor who was declaring him dead, and managed to live and became a motivational speaker after the war. I know I was at West Point when he came in 1981, I think it was, and it was incredible. I mean, we were all ready to chew our bayonets after he finished speaking. He was an incredible speaker. I think a couple left here. Camp Beauregard, it's a Louisiana National Guard base. I would name it after Troy Middleton, who's from Louisiana. Well, he's not from Louisiana, he's from Mississippi. But he had significant ties to Louisiana. He also had a very distinguished U.S. Army career. The youngest regimental commander in World War I, awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, very high honor, the second highest medal. Served as a professor of military science at LSU, retired in 1937 to become the dean there, dean of administration, but then rejoined, offered his services back to the U.S. Army after Pearl Harbor. And he commanded the 45th Infantry Division, turned it into one of the premier divisions in the European Theater of Operations. And then he commanded 8th Corps in France and Germany. And famously, it was that corps which held off the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge long enough for reinforcements to flow to the Ardennes forest. He returned to LSU after the war, became its president for 11 years, beginning in 1951. And so I think he would be a pretty popular choice in the state of Louisiana, and also with a very distinguished U.S. Army service. And then finally, Fort Hood. Well, let's name it after Audie Murphy. I think most of you know his rags to riches story. Enlisted at age 17 to help pay, the bills for his family. He had 12 siblings. His father had left school. I mean, it really was the rags to riches. His combat record was so distinguished, he earned every U.S. combat award for valor. He rose from private to first lieutenant. Medal of Honor granted for actions in the Colmar Pocket in France in January 1945 when he hopped on top of a Sherman tank and with its 50 caliber machine gun held off an entire company of German soldiers that were attacking his unit's position. After the war, he suffered badly from PTSD. He also became a movie actor, but he advocated for the study of PTSD. He didn't know what it was called then, but that's what he was doing, and extended healthcare benefits for veterans. And I think significantly, the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club was formed at Fort Hood in 1986. And it is the premier fraternity, if you will, for US non-commissioned officers today. If you are one of the top non-commissioned officers, you get nominated to become a Sergeant Audie Murphy Club member. I think it would be only fitting to name Fort Hood after him. So I will leave it there, and I will return the microphone to Jenny, who's going to monitor the Q&A session. I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Pete, Hassan, and Mark. I have the unfortunate task of having to moderate the Q&A and choose from we have a plethora of questions. I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. It is what it is. I'm really sorry about that. But the first question that I'm going to put forward is actually coming from the director of the Mershon Center, the director who our chief gets to have his question come through first. And so this question is coming from Professor Chris Jelpy, who asks, that says that he would be interested to hear from any of the panelists about what their sense is of the level of support for name changes like these among senior military leadership, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, etc. I figured, Pete, that you would want to go plunging into that one.
Yeah, I've been in touch with General David Petraeus, James Mattis, and some others that I knew during my time in service, and they're all fully supportive of changing the names. I've offered to be part of a base renaming commission. I'm not sure I would be selected, but it would be a real honor to take part in that endeavor. And so there's no one at the senior ranks who would push back, and all are really fully supportive of it. Just because they, you wear the uniform of the United States Army for, in my case, 26 years, in their case, even longer. It really sticks in your throat when you see that people who gave up their commissions to fight against the United States are honored in this way. We had someone email me before a couple days ago, who's I think in the audience now, and he said, "Are there any other bases that have ever been renamed because of someone giving up their Army commission?" And why, yes, there was. The premier fort at West Point used to be called Fort Arnold, after Benedict Arnold, who became a traitor in the American Revolution. And when he became a traitor, they erased his name from the installation and renamed it Fort Clinton, after a Continental officer. The cadets at West Point also, there was a plaque in the chapel at West Point at one point that had the names of significant Revolutionary War heroes. And Benedict Arnold's name was there because he was a significant hero at the Battle of Saratoga. But because he became a traitor, they literally scratched out his name. And you can go to that chapel today and see this blank space where they crossed out his name. And he was persona non grata after that. So I don't see why the same wouldn't apply to Confederate officers.
Great, thank you, Pete. You've also highlighted the fact that I have received a couple of questions that arrived before the chat. So that was one of the questions that was on my list to be asking. Another question that I received, not in the Zoom Q&A queue, was have there been many of the bases are named after officers who were either revered in Southern lore or who had significant political careers afterwards. This, Mark, is a question that's been directed towards you, I believe. But can Mark provide examples of Southern officers who had large roles in the war but were shunned afterwards?
Well, one certainly comes to mind, and that is James Longstreet, Lee's warhorse, who had the bad taste to become a Republican after the war. And that did not sit well with pretty much every white Southerner in the South. No, he seriously was anathema to many. And during the Reconstruction violence, in New Orleans, during the Reconstruction, Longstreet played a role in putting down that violence and restoring order. So once again, Longstreet would not have been a good choice in the minds of many white Southerners.
Thank you. So I have a two-part question from one of our former colleagues, an emeritus professor in the history department, Professor Les Benedict, who asks, first, has any research been done on whether there was a Black response to the naming and renaming of bases after Confederate military officers? Did Southern white politicians take credit for the naming and renaming? Did President Wilson play a role? Was it a conscious effort to erase the stain, quote unquote, of treason from the Confederacy in general?
My impression is that the thing that needed to be done was name those installations and get on with the business of training troops for war. What was going on was that the government was coming in and buying up thousands of acres all of a sudden and it didn't need any trouble with the locals. And so it handed responsibility for naming these installations largely in the hands of local chambers of commerce. Not a lot, as far as I can tell, not a lot of time was spent figuring out the names of these things, and there were not a lot of stakeholders who were involved with it.
And I would add with regard to African Americans, there's not a lot of energy being exerted to push back against the naming, in part because, particularly in the South, who was going to listen to them? African Americans had been eliminated from the voter registration roll, so politicians weren't going to listen to them. This was part of a sweep of renaming and establishing these sort of white supremacist markers in the public space. Wilson was a known segregationist, so efforts were put into other areas, such, for example, like stopping or trying to prevent screenings of Birth of a Nation, which is occurring right in this same sort of moment. So was there interest and was there recognition? Absolutely, that this was problematic, but in the larger sweep of things in the moment, energy was being directed less to sort of prevent naming and literally to prevent the loss of lives, since this was the era of lynching, and then as we move a little forward, racial programs and the like.
Okay, our next question, how much of the concerted effort to memorialize Confederate generals, et cetera, may be linked to organizations such as Daughters of the Confederacy? The Confederate monuments seem to be statues and therefore more prominent in cityscapes and substantive structures such as forts, I think, than substantive structures such as forts. So how much of a role was played by organizations such as the Daughters of the Confederacy?
In terms of I'm sorry, in terms of the construction of numerous Confederate monuments, the Daughters of the Confederacy played an extraordinarily large role, and they were prominent in other kinds of things. The Museum of the Confederacy is in some measure the work of the Daughters of the Confederacy. As far as it goes, during the Harper's Ferry raid in 1859, the first fatality was a night watchman for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, who was African-American, free Black. And the Daughters of the Confederacy made sure that he was memorialized as well as one of the many loyal Negroes during the Civil War era. And of course, Negro is the term that they would have used at that particular time. And this would have been, Hayward Shepherd is the fellow's name. This would have been part of a propaganda campaign, really, to say that many African Americans in the South were, felt congenially toward their Southern masters and were loyal even during the context of the American Civil War. That is, as Professor Jeffries could probably tell us, a problematic interpretation of things, but it was something that the Daughters of the Confederacy pushed pretty heavily.
And I would add only to that the Daughters of the Confederacy are very active as well in curriculum development and getting the myth of the lost cause and the myth of the Confederacy woven into state curricula requirements, Virginia all the way down. And so it's interesting, you often hear the charge or the accusation of this is revisionist history when you're going back and renaming statues or something of the sort, when in fact the major revision to history had already been done. And that charge was led by the Daughters of the Confederacy a century ago.
We have a somewhat related question that asks us to look at these, the naming of these military installations as part of a concerted effort to the question to quote unquote repatriate the South after the Civil War. and to memorialize significant military figures as part of the effort to not treat the South as a defeated enemy. How much of this is, how much of the do you all see this as being, is this actually part of a concerted effort, these decisions to name the bases, is this part of a concerted effort to
you didn't
reconciliation?
You didn't need to have to rehabilitate these men. The taint of treason scarcely touched any of them, because in the decades after the American Civil War, what triumphed was an interpretation of the Civil War as one that was fought for different but equally valid morally visions of the American future. And this was the kind of tacit bargain between North and South. And to give you an idea of just how little taint of treason attached to any of these, during the Spanish-American War, two former Confederate generals, Joseph Wheeler and Fitzhugh Lee, the nephew of Robert E. Lee, were brought back into service. Of course, last time it had been Confederate service, but this time it was United States service. And they served during the Santiago campaign, where when American forces ran off Spanish troops in an early skirmish, Joseph Wheeler exclaimed, "The Yankees are running, the Yankees are running." Oh, I mean the Spanish.
Great. We have a series of questions that ask us, and I think actually really are asking you, Pete, why the bases have to be named after someone in particular. Why one of the people who have posed questions are asking why not just use some vague reference, location, or something like that. Someone else has asked, why not name them after, why do bases have to be named after soldiers? Why not name them? Schools aren't named after educators. Airports are rarely named after aviators. Why does it have to be a military officer that these bases be named for?
Well, it doesn't have to be. It's just tradition that bases are named after significant figures in the service's history, or sometimes based on location. So Fort Belvoir would be an example of that. And there's other examples of forts out west that were named after the location, and not, but a lot of them were eventually renamed after significant military figures as time went on, just to honor the service of the soldiers, thereby being honored. So there's no hard and fast rule. This is something that Congress might want to opine on, but I, as a soldier serving at one of these bases, and having served at these bases, would like to see soldiers honored rather than politicians or humanitarians or whoever else you would name them after. And if you want to be completely anodyne, then you could just name it after the local town or river, Fort Killeen, Texas, instead of Fort Hood. But that would, I think, lack a certain zing to the name.
I think they should all be renamed after educators and professors. Would be, I think, just perfect.
Fort Siegel has a nice ring to it.
Exactly. It's what everyone in my family has always hoped for. We've also received a series of questions, sticking with you, Pete, that are dealing with the questions of the practicalities of renaming these bases. What would it take? What would be the process of actually seeing this through, and what would the costs be of renaming bases?
Yeah, so I think you would see some sort of commission that would have historians on it, would have maybe retired senior military officers on it, and maybe led by some eminent politician. maybe a former US president, maybe George W. Bush could, lead the commission, but probably more someone like Colin Powell or Dave Petraeus would lead it. And then they would get a slate of bases. They would present this to the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense. And it's at that level, I think, where the names would be approved. I don't think it would have to go to Congress unless Congress mandated it. And then in terms of changing the base names, yeah, there would have to be some money set aside for new signage, new stationery, but it's pretty minimal in the grand scheme of things. A lot of stuff is online these days. That's easily changed. The signage around the posts is pretty easily changed. So I don't think there would be a significant cost to this at all.
Do we have a question?
I think another issue is, what do you do in the museum? Each of these bases, a lot of them have their own post museum. So now there's got to be some thought put into new exhibits based on whoever the new honoree is. And what do you do with the exhibit that talks about Braxton Bragg? Well, I think you keep it there, but you have to have context around it.
I agree with you, actually, but we also have a question that asks us to speak more fully. We haven't really touched on the controversy at the moment. This question is pointing out that these bases were named 100 years ago, and as several of you have already remarked, veterans and presumably current servicemen and women do not know or care about the names, as you highlighted, Pete. So what is the reasoning or controversy as to why they should or should not be renamed? And this is really the crux of the matter.
Well, let me start just with the veterans aspect, and then I'll turn it over to Hassan maybe to talk about the political aspect. Veterans have been arguing that these bases should be renamed for decades. All right, I entered the Army in 1978, and I know at least as early as the 1980s, we were calling for, some of us were calling for these bases to be renamed. It's something that continues to crop up every few years. And then you have a real healthy discussion between those from the South and those from other parts of the United States over, why we should do this or not should do this. And it all comes down to politics in the end. But from the view of those who have served the uniform, the vast majority, at least that I've been in touch with, would welcome the renaming, and a lot of them have been calling it for quite some time. So maybe Hassan could talk more about the politics surrounding the renaming.
Yeah, I would add only that it is exactly that. It's a political issue, that is exacerbated with the current President of the United States, and among others, chief among others, who are using the issue as a political wedge to pretend as though that renaming these bases is part of a frontal assault on all things Western civilization, on all things American history, framed as such. That this is some attempt to erase history American, as though there is such a thing as doing that. And so it is right now, and has been a political issue. It need not be, as Dr. Mansour, as Pete had pointed out, if you just want to go on record, right, and say, who served and served honorably and with distinction, you're not talking about these cats who took up arms against the nation. So it is politics, but the political winds are changing. And so the fact that you already have Congress moving in that direction, that you have the top brass moving in that direction, going on record, then I think it won't be too long before we do see this change.
We have a question about a specific possibility of a renaming here. And this question asks if any of you think there could be a good case made for renaming an Army base after U.S. Representative Robert Smalls, the escaped slave and military veteran who opened the door for African Americans to serve during the Civil War. Also, how about World War I veteran Harry Truman, who made the decision to integrate the force?
Well, I'll just go. I like the idea of Robert Smalls, right? I mean, what more? We need some movie. I think there's actually a movie supposed to be. I could have just dreamed that up, right? This idea of an enslaved African American stealing the steamboat, the paddle boat, the planter, and over and taking it over, using the signals and getting over to the Union forces, and then serving. So yeah, and put that right in South Carolina, right? I mean, that's what we need to do. So I'm totally cool with that.
Well, there's only one problem with that that suggestion, which is that Smalls properly belongs as the namesake of a naval institution, as opposed to an Army institution. But otherwise, Smalls would be a terrific choice for to be named the namesake of an American military institution. That is certainly the case.
I'd like to actually ask possibly the last question, building on a question that appeared in the chat, which is suggesting the question, the possibility of, I don't know, the transience of these of potentially new names. This question in the chat asked us to consider. Are any of you concerned with the possibility that renaming these bases and installations now will just start a trend where every few years we are renaming the military bases and installations? For as someone who spent a considerable bit of time in the Russian Federation in the early years after the fall of the Soviet Union, when everything was being renamed and you couldn't rely on a map because every single street on the map had a different name. Do you think is there any reason for concern that this will be that the renaming of these bases will unleash a perpetual chain of change of nomenclature with the passing fancy of new administrations, for example? What do you think?
Well, it's always a possibility, but if you choose the names, I think, appropriately, then the chances of that are lessened. Alan Millett, my advisor, and he's on the chat there, pointed out that Troy Middleton does not have a great record in terms of his integrationist views as president of LSU, so he needs to be crossed off my list. And thanks, Alan. I will look back into his record there. But that's why you have a commission that goes into this in great detail. I did this in a couple days' work, but a commission that thoroughly examines the record, makes sure that the good the person did in his life outweighs any flaws he or she might have had, and you do your best.
I think that a lot of this is a function of the fact that we have not yet achieved the kind of substantive change that is required at this moment. And so we're settling for symbolic gestures. Once substantive change occurs, and I think really we are still fighting the battles, but the war has been won. Things, the change is coming. The change that James Baldwin predicted was going to come back in the 1960s. That whites would find that the firmament had changed, and that African Americans, and for that matter Hispanics and Asians, were getting their proper place in American society. That's going to happen, and then it's simply not going to be all that relevant about the names of installations and whether certain statues should stick around and so on.
Yeah, I would add that's a great point that Mark just made, Dr. Grimm just made. You know, these are modest proposals. These are modest changes. Nobody is going to be lifted out of poverty because Fort Bragg's name is changed. But these are meaningful, modest but meaningful, because they do occupy space in the public imagination. They do symbolize and represent principles and ideals. And so that begs, that ties into, I think, your question, Dr. Siegel, Jenny, and that is, you know, will this lead to, you know, changes in names of bases and installations and streets and schools and statues down the road? Yeah, that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Like everything is context specific, right? These come, the monuments, the names, the you know, how we choose to memorialize things are specific to a moment in society, reflect the views and principles of the society in that particular moment. I think any healthy society over time should pause, reflect, and look and take an assessment of, do these statues, do these symbols actually reflect who we are and who we want to be? That, I think, is a sign of a healthy society and not necessarily a totalitarian. I mean, you can go in another direction, but also a sign of a democratic society, because our views and our principles will change, will evolve. And I think incorporating that in a systematic way, right? I mean, not arbitrary, but really, is this who we are? I think yes. I think we should always do that. And will that lead to change? Yes. Will it lead to people saying, no, we got it right, we're still good, we're gonna keep it this way? That's totally fine too. But it should reflect who we are as a nation in the moment, and not who we were a century ago, if we are no longer that.
Well, on behalf of the 210 people who were participating in this webinar from the audience, I would like to thank all of you, to thank our panelists for this really thought-provoking and extremely educational discussion of the question of what is in a name. I would like to also reiterate what you all saw in the slides before we began our presentation today. The next public event that the American Foreign and Military Policy Research Cluster is sponsoring will be on October 6th, when Professor Scott Sagan, a professor of political science at Stanford University, is going to be speaking with us. The details will soon be posted on the Mershon website. And we invite each and every one of you and everyone else you know to join us for what will surely be a truly interesting discussion from Professor Sagan. And thanks to all of the people in the audience for joining us here this afternoon.